speaker.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I'm Rhonda Atkinson. I live here in Celebration, and I am a member of the Abraham Saleh chapter of the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And so we are the sponsor for this particular lecture by Professor Carl Priestman. Professor Priestman is the chair and professor of, and it's history, right, Carl?
Yes.
Yes, history at Valencia College's East Campus. And Carl, how long have you been there?
20 years.
Wow, it goes by quickly.
It does indeed.
I can tell you, Professor Priestman is a very popular professor, and he contributes to a number of initiatives on campus, and he is well liked by colleagues, students, and staff alike. Valencia has little faculty websites, and so I looked at his just to kind of get some background on him. And one of the things that he put in his information was that he spends his time helping others become, as T. Lawrence said, dangerous people who act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. I thought that was a great quotation just for life, and also for the topic of tonight's talk, which is compromise to Constitution. So Professor Priestman, I will let you take it away.
Thanks, Rhonda. It is so good to be here with you guys. Maybe one day I'll get to be in present with you in the body, but the magic of Zoom, we're able to use this, and I so look forward to it. It's a great pleasure to be in the session with you guys. So we're just going to dive right in. If you were in person, I would say interrupt me if you have a question, but please jot it down so you can remember, wait, I don't understand this. As I tell my students, I would much rather not get through the presentation and avoid losing you. So I don't want to lose you as we go. All right. So here's the story that most people think they know about our country. Right. So, whoops, got to get myself here. So July 3rd, we formed a decision to kind of form our own country, go our own way. Then we fought a little war. We were kind of minding our own business, and this evil country, England, decided that they were going to take over our lands and they were going to do harmful things to us. Eventually, we decided we needed a government. So we formed a government. We wrote a document that would guide us, and everybody loved it, and we all lived happily ever after. And that's our story. And that is a myth. All of those things, except for some of the dates, are inaccurate, or they're lacking. They're not as complete as we need to get into. And one of the jobs of a historian, as I tell my students, is to some degree, as best we can, to hold our own opinions loosely. We can't say don't have an opinion, because everybody does, and let the evidence really speak to us. So as we look back and we say, well, what happened in our founding moment? We want to try to understand, well, what does the evidence show us, not what we wish it would say. So we kind of got to dig back into that. So we're going to go all the way back. We're actually going to start at the end of our lecture, right? So at the end of our lecture, we create a document called the Constitution. And this is obviously what we celebrate on September 17th, Constitution Day. There's a very famous painting. So showing all the major contributors there, having completed their task. Washington standing regally at the post, although he really was unhappy to be there, just so to say it. And so that's where we are, right? This is where we do this thing. We sign the Constitution, but it turns out it was actually pretty controversial. In December of 1788, they'll have the first election. The states were chose to come up with who their electors were. Those electors were to meet by February of 1789, and the Electoral College chose, as you know, George Washington as our first president. He was unanimously selected on the first ballot of all the electors. But by that point, we were only a nation of 11 states. North Carolina and Rhode Island had rejected the Constitution, and in essence were foreign entities. We weren't really sure what we were going to do with Rhode Island or North Carolina, but it was going to be tight to figure out what would need to happen. And of course, there was already beginning conversations to get there, but it wasn't as if the rest of the country was uniformly excited about the Constitution. In fact, most of the large states, with the exception of Pennsylvania, had voted very tightly on this decision. So the ratification was a close run thing and almost did not make it through based on their own set of rules. And as we'll see, to some degree, we could accuse Madison of kind of stacking the deck to try to make the ratification easier than it perhaps should have been under the rules as we had them in our current government. So how did we get here? So this is where we're going to go all the way back, because what we're really dealing with when we talk about the Constitution is what was Madison and Hamilton to a lesser degree, who's obviously more famous with his play, but he's one of the young leaders who was saying, our government as we know it is wrong. And so what is happening is what we do in 1787, an effort to strengthen our national identity and create a government that would be more beneficial to all, created by we the people, or as it was stated by many at the time, was this some sort of a treasonous act of overthrowing the very revolutionary philosophies and concepts that had birthed the nation? So that's kind of what we're going to look into tonight, basically what led into it and then what compromises were necessary to get through. Because as you may know from compromises, not everybody's going to leave happy. So it's really, when you look at the creation of the Constitution, it ends up being the kind of thing that we can see is what leads us to the earliest division in the country. Because again, having fought the revolution and to some degree having banished the loyalists, you could say in 1783, we were all happy and together. And yet by 1787, we have the first embryonic political parties. Now, they didn't know them as political parties, and would be incorrect to call them our first official political parties. Those will come the next decade. But it certainly was true that those who had been united together in an effort to win a war against Britain now were on very different sides and casting very strong aspersions and accusations at each other as to what was really going on. So what is happening here? Let's back up and just make sure you get a running start. I'm sure, particularly with the DAR, you guys are well versed in this, but just to give it a running start. You know, our first colony that is successful in Jamestown from an English point of view, 1608. Of course, St. Augustine here in Florida was before that with the Spanish. And eventually various colonies will congeal into 13 larger units, the 13 states that we know of. For most of that time, the government did not really give much time or effort to watching it. It was largely embroiled in what I call the Second Hundred Years' War, a long period of time in which England and France were once again at odds with each other, really for who would become dominant in Europe. In the end, England will win, at least for a brief moment. There's still more to go in this contest, as you know, leading to the French Revolution, which will occur in the early 1800s. England wins. She wins as herself, the island, but obviously all of her victorious lands and her colonies. However, she's deeply, deeply in debt. And this debt, as we know from our own current day experience in the past 20 years, wars are very expensive. And because they're very expensive, this question about the debts will be what leads to what we call the road to the revolution. From 1763 to 1776, there's a whole issue of questions. And there's a lot of famous things that people believe they know, and we're not going to get stuck here in the revolution. So I'll leave them lying. But ultimately, when you examine the American Revolution, it is not about taxation. It's not about representation. It's not about economics. It's not about many of the things that we think. It's ultimately about this issue of control because of the benign neglect, our term for it, but basically the idea that the English government pretty much left the colonies to live on their own. They had grown quite used to having their own say in what would happen. So this revolution was a moment where, with the new coming of King George III, the new king, in the middle of the French Indian War, decided afterwards, his government, he didn't do it directly, his government decided we've got to pay these taxes. So how do we pay the taxes? We get a group of citizens who currently are paying very little in taxes to pay their fair share. Well, that didn't go well. And as you know, ultimately would lead to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The first battles, actually the year before, in Bunker Hill in 1775, or Lexington Concord even before that. And war ensues, which ultimately we see it as an American victory in 1781. Well, now, when you look at what the founders who were at Philadelphia begin to say to each other really early in 75, actually into 76, men like John Adams are already beginning to ask, well, what will we do if we win? Meaning, what kind of governance will we propose if we win? And so this question of the governance becomes really central to their conversations. Once it's over, the war is over. You always have to remember, of course, history is not determinate. So we know it ended, so we can read the revolution and the battles and kind of just know happily. It's like watching Star Wars for the 14th time. You know what happens at the end. They were living through it in a sense of, like we live through the events we're living through now. You don't really know what's happening and what will transpire. And so in one sense, the choice to declare their independence was, like Caesar experienced crossing the Rubicon, but they didn't know where that was going to go. And yet while they're doing it, these questions are kind of in their mix of, well, we think we're going to win. We hope we're going to win. So what do we do with that? And so they're going to move and create this experiment that we're still living out today. When and of course, some of you are here because you're interested in our government and in our Constitution. It's a very rare thing what we set out to do. And remember, I'm going to back up a slide, that England was the most liberal nation on the planet. There was no country as liberal as England, and we were citizens of England, of Great Britain. And we were happy to say so. Ben Franklin and many others would happily say we were happy citizens of this most liberal country. And yet, by 76, we threw it off. And we did what? Well, we were going to try to create a civic structure that would allow every person, not just rich or nobility, to participate. We also were creating and speaking into existence new ideas that had never been heard before. Adam Smith, as you may know, famously writes what becomes the Bible of capitalism, Wealth of Nations, and it's published in 1776. Nobody had talked about capitalism, and yet when we argued over questions of smuggling, like men like John Hancock, was he a smuggler or just a businessman? We were talking about the concepts of free trade, which, as you know, is kind of a hallmark of capitalism, and the idea of rights, and all citizens to some degree having a participation opportunity. However, there were a lot of questions, and on that very question there, well, are we going to extend these rights to women? What about to the native peoples who already live there? And certainly, how can liberty exist in a place in which in all 13 states, there are people who were enslaved working for people who owned them as property? Is government us or is government them? Can we do a government of common people across a vast distance? It had never been tried at this size before. In fact, when you study the collapse of the Roman Republic, one of the key things that we see is that it was not suited for the size of its governance. And this was perhaps the most tricky, which will come out most in the rest of the conversation. If the idea of a nation is really several small parts who saw themselves as independent, can you have a larger entity? You and I are seeing this in our last, say, 30 years with watching the EU and Europe, as they've gone back and forth about where their lines are drawn between their own independence and their own sense of connection. And how do we fit into that? Most famously, most recently, England deciding they wanted to leave. Well, can you have a civic entity as a single, what we would call nation, if the parts themselves believe that they themselves are independent? And when you look at the government and the individuals who were alive in, say, 1770 to 1800, very few people ever thought in terms of there being a single nation. In fact, you can read up into the 1850s and 1860s, private letters of people who might have traveled abroad to Europe, most famously or usually to France, writing about how they wish they could go home to their native soil. And their native soil would be Virginia or Maryland or Pennsylvania. They would never have gone to France and said, oh, I'm a citizen of the United States. So from the very beginning, we have this challenge that we will know most famously connected to the Civil War, where we say, what's the issue with states' rights? And we'll leave that aside for now, but just understand as they're thinking about forming this thing, when they're making this declaration, the idea that we would become a single something was widely unknown. And this is why the anti-federalists in particular will be so adamant in their arguments against what is happening. At the root of what the governance is that they're going to try to put together is John Locke. John Locke cast a tremendously large shadow over everything that comes with our governance. And you may be familiar with John Locke, but let's just get a review of this. He's writing and alive at the time of the previous great crisis, the English Glorious Revolution, which occurs in the time of coming of King Charles II. So now that we have a new monarch, King Charles III, over the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, it's interesting. When his name came out, I was like, oh yes, the last two Charleses didn't work very well. I hope it works better for him. John Locke is one of the principal thinkers at this time, at the latter part of the British 1700s or 17th century. And he writes two treatises of governance. So in his idea of government is rooted on his view of human nature. And for John Locke, the human is naturally good. The human basically will do well with one another without too much force. And remember, what are they doing in the Glorious Revolution is they're throwing off what they perceive to be in Charles II and his brother who had just recently passed, James II, throwing off a tyrannical or absolutist monarch. Now, Locke is not saying he doesn't want monarch. He was an avid supporter of the new monarchs, William and Mary. And so he was very supportive of them coming in as monarchs. But as you may know, in the Glorious Revolution, what transpires is a more empowered parliamentary system in which the people had a voice through elected representatives, although very few people ever got to vote for anybody in England at this time. For Locke, famously, which you may know Jefferson basically plagiarizes, he said that the individual has a right given to them by God of life, liberty, and their own property. And again, if you go back and study what was happening in England, you can really see where Locke is coming from. So in this setting, Locke then is arguing because humans are naturally good, there's no corruption largely in most humans. Therefore, to deal with any possible negativities, the humans would establish a civil society and it would allow for there to be a government. However, the government would be very, very weak. The central government of the entity would have limited power. And so when you look then at the Declaration of Independence and soon the government that they will write starting in 1776, they will begin the process of writing what will be our government. It reflects Locke, that there should be government only at the most weakest level. In one sense, you would only interface with the government if you went to one of Franklin's post offices. Otherwise, the government should leave you alone. This gets into the idea that the founders were thinking about back to, is government us or them? And where should the locus of power lie? So for the majority of the colonists and now the citizens of the new United States, the locus of power should lie close to me, not far away. So government should never become a them who lives far away, because in their minds, that was one of the key things they fought against. Paine famously wrote about it in Common Sense in early 76, that how can a government 3,000 miles away have any control over us? They won't know what we're going through, ergo, they should not have a power to dictate to us really about anything. So this concept is really embedded in Locke, and it becomes really clear in what the founders were trying to do with the writing of the Declaration and their first government, which is called the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation will really be a Lockean document demanding the central government be extraordinarily weak, leaving power at the state level. The government should be close to the people in all decision making. Now, if we were taking time to really dissect Locke, there's a lot of things that I would say here about Locke and where you draw those lines. And I think there's things I would love to be able to ask him what he thought, and he doesn't really speak of these things in the two treatises of government. But obviously you can take government being close to me to its nth degree. And by the way, if you do that, you end up with Rousseau. So where Rousseau's argument that in the state of nature, man is best when they're basically alone. And he's really, Rousseau, arguing for a more anarchist view in which there should be no government whatsoever. Rousseau will mediate his own self and end up back with a democracy, but he only does that under duress. Rousseau doesn't want there to be any government. So you can kind of see Rousseau's to, I guess we would say the left or more radical to this idea of where does power lie from Locke. Because again, remember, a lot of people will say, oh, Locke was anti-monarch. Not at all. Locke was very happy with the monarch, but he wanted the monarch to be weak in the central government. Okay, I wish I could see all your faces and make sure I haven't lost you, because that's why I like to do my classes like, have I lost you? I want to make sure you don't get lost. But again, if you have questions, I please hope you're writing them down. All right, so what is the Articles of Confederation, right? The Articles of Confederation, it's our first government. It was written by a man named John Dickinson. Interesting about John Dickinson is he was the one who led the opposition to the Declaration. When we voted on our Declaration, it was not unanimously supported. It was initially voted against by 4 states who were afraid. So the Second Continental Congress has a healthy degree of loyalists or moderate loyalists who are not eager to do this. And Dickinson's one of them. But for his own bona fides and his own acceptance by other people like John Adams, who really was the leader of the country in the time of the Second Continental Congress, Dickinson is the person who chairs the committee that writes our first government. And so they'll begin in 76. They begin their work working off some documents of Franklin. Franklin's the one founder you can point to in our country who you could say he really did like embrace Locke totally. And to some degree, I would say Franklin's the one founder who would have been open to a democracy. Hopefully with you guys, I don't have to explain that we're not a democracy, that we're a republic. If you need to ask that question at the end, I will go through it, but we'll just run on from here. We're not a democracy. The Articles are not a democracy. The Constitution is not a democracy. Both are a republic. But I say that because you can see Dickinson worked off of Franklin's ideas. Now, Franklin is the godfather, right, of the country. If there have been photos taken of all the key moments in US history, Franklin's at all of them up until his death. And so back in 1754, when we were beginning the process of preparing to fight for the French and Indian War, Franklin was the one who led for our very first kind of Continental Congress. It was called the Albany Congress, as it met in Albany, New York. But it was one talking about what should we do? How should we best fight the French and their allies? And at that moment, Franklin suggested what would have been wise for England to have heard, which was to form basically a commonwealth, the same sort of idea that they eventually will do in the 1800s. And he hammered this for a long time, up until really 75, and nobody in England will listen to him. So Dickinson, his committee is going to work from where Franklin is, building a very Lockean document. Obviously, the war itself prolonged the ratification process, but notice what also prolonged the ratification process is because as they would go state to state and try to get people on board with this national government, there was already a strong opposition. No, we're not fighting to replace one national government, the king, with any other national government. Again, in the minds of every person or most people at this time, where's your nation? Well, my nation's Georgia. My nation's New York. And at best, we'll have some loose agreement. And that's really what they state, that the document says that they would form a, quote, firm league of friendship. And why? To create a common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare. Well, that sounds all great, but again, it's by the states. Remember, the Constitution says famously and also controversially, we the people. So it's a whole different piece of agenda there that Madison's going to go to. In the Articles, the states remain sovereign and independent. No state had any kind of a trump card they could play over anybody else, nor could they restrict any kind of movement of citizens. And again, the national government had very limited power. Now, between its ratification in 1786, many of the aspects of how the government would work begin to appear. And for some people like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, what appears seems to be weaknesses. So for instance, Adams is in England as our first ambassador, Jefferson's in Paris as our ambassador to Paris, to France, and they were already writing letters back to Congress saying, we're in trouble, our credit is terrible, and we're in debt because of the war, we need to get money, we can't get money because we don't look like we even know what we're doing. And you can see there, the Congress did not have the ability to tax anybody. Now, some of that we may go, yay, but nonetheless, it meant that they were going to have economic challenges. And so, for instance, what was supposed to happen was Congress would ask the states to pony up the money based on size. And so like in 1781, the request was in for $3 million. That was our national budget, $3 million. the states gave $39,000. So you can see automatically that Locke's ideas, because again, when you look at Locke and you play it out, and this will become where Jefferson and Washington will grow to hate each other. So remember, Jefferson and Washington will go to their graves as enemies. So you can like Jefferson or you can like Washington, but you can't like them both. You got to be on Team Jefferson or Team Washington. You got to pick your poison, and the other guy, you can't be with him. And so in the debates that they would have, you can almost hear Jefferson saying to Washington, the Lockean philosophies of the goodness of the human. Now, we don't need these laws because people are good. And you can almost hear Washington in return going, Tom, you weren't at Valley Forge when we were starving to death and having no shoes and having no food, and nearby farmers would not give us any of the stuff we needed. Locke's idea of the virtuous person who will just naturally see the problem of their community or of their neighbors or of their nation and then rise to meet it sounds good on paper, but was not Washington's experience in the practical world. I'll add, it's not really my experience either in the practical world. And so you can see it here where the states were expected to pay their fair share to this confederation, and they just didn't do it. They just refused to do it. And then you begin to start seeing issues, as maybe could have been foreseen, whereby different citizens in different states were unhappy. Now, you and I know this happens all the time, but we have several citizens who are unhappy today about a variety of different things. But they, at that time, were kind of caught off guard by this. Again, there's a sense almost in which their thought was, now that we've won the war and we have control, that's our whole thing, we have control, everything will be groovy. But a lot of the same issues that were there over who's making the decisions, who's paying what taxes, how much would the taxes be, would spring to life in a variety of places. One of the most famous areas, or just general areas, was between the urban centers in the various states and the rural centers in the various states. And so the very complaint that the patriots had made about England, how can that government way over there know what we're going through and tax us, became the exact same thing that people in the frontier were saying in all the various states. We're in the frontier over here. How can the government way over there in Boston or way over there in Albany or way over there in Richmond know what we're going through? So how do they get to tax us? How do they get to declare for us what to do? And most famously in Massachusetts, this comes up with Shays' Rebellion. So Daniel Shays was a veteran of the war, and he really didn't lead the rebellion, but his name became kind of the dominant name in this moment. But it's really just this uprising in Pennsylvania, in Massachusetts. And what's really interesting about this is the governor at that time is John Hancock. So John Hancock, he was a fighter, right? He was a fighter for patriotism, for liberty. And so you would hear, if I told you, hey, there's a rebellion and Hancock's in charge, well, one would almost imagine Hancock would have ridden off to join them. But instead, as the governor, now that he's in charge, we're not going to have any of this craziness. So he issues an order for the military to kill, slay, and destroy, if necessary, anybody who gets in his way. So for many people, you begin to say, well, wait a minute. What were they fighting for in 76 if this is the experience in 1784, 85? So it's this moment that these young leaders like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton begin saying, okay, wait, this thing we're trying to do, it's not working. There's no way for the national government to declare, itself. Madison was a congressman in the Articles of Confederation Congress, and often Congress never met because when they would get there would not be a quorum of enough states. Now, some of us might say, I kind of wish Congress would maybe not meet at all either. But in general terms, we kind of want our legislators to get up there and do some work and get through some things. Something I wish maybe some of our current Congress people would decide to do. Get through some things. But you can't get through anything if there's no quorum. And so they begin to say, we're going to have to strengthen the government. Now, what that meant, and I think Madison, were he here, he would dispute this with me. So just cards on the table to protect James in his opinion. But I'm going to tell you, he was asking for Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes is the other English philosopher that dominates the 17th century for the English years of crisis through the Stuart family who rules after Queen Elizabeth. And Hobbes begins coming into his fore at the first major conflict in that century in England, the time of the English Civil War, 1642. Hobbes takes a very different view from Locke. And you really need to think of Locke as almost responding to Hobbes, But I showed you Locke first because he's the dominant thinker for us and certainly for the writing of the articles. Hobbes writes a book called Leviathan. Some of you may recognize that name from the Bible, but it's not a Bible term. It's an old Greek term. It's an old kind of English Middle Ages type of term representing a gigantic, fantastical beast for which if you and I were at New Smyrna at the beach and this thing came out of the water, we would all freak out and be scared to death. And that's the point for Hobbes. For Hobbes, unlike Locke, in the state of nature, society is brutal. People are not nice. People are easily corrupted, and humans are always self-focused. Now, be careful here. For a lot of people, when they study Hobbes, they'll say that Hobbes says humans are selfish. And I always try to warn my students, let's not use the selfish word, because for most of us, selfish is a moral word for which we try to say, that's not me. And we try to push it away and say, yeah, that's terrible. People shouldn't be selfish. You know somebody else who is selfish, but you, of course, are not selfish. That's not Hobbes's point. Hobbes's point is that every human, and I'll just say for me, but I'm going to guess for you, and I know Rhonda, and I love her to death as a good friend, but I know Rhonda, and we're all self-focused. And what he means by that is when push comes to shove, we're going to naturally, in our species' basic self, think for ourselves first, defend ourselves first, work for ourselves first. Again, some people don't like to hear that, and they challenge me, and that's fine. I just will say this for us. Have you driven on I-4 lately? If you have, you know Hobbes is right. So what is he talking about? Well, what he says is because we are this way, we need a contract. He's the first one to ever talk about a social contract. Long before Rousseau writes, Hobbes is first. And he's saying we need a social contract to do what? To protect us from ourselves. Where are we going to battle? When he says that the human is in a condition called war with each other, what is he talking about? Well, he says there's three major areas. One, there'll just be basic competition for goods and services. We would, in his day, in the state of nature, water and food. Right? Secondly, there's the pursuit of safety, meaning I recognize that this other person is a threat, so I will lash out at them before they can hurt me. And then thirdly, for some people, there's this sense of a pursuit of glory. I will do things to gain more for myself so that I then am seen in a more exalted or more powerful position by my neighbors. So what Hobbes says is since every human is this way, we need a strong central government that has excessive power to be the Leviathan. And you can see the quote there. You need a common power to keep the humans in awe, so that they then that are in that condition, which are called war, they will instead be not doing that, basically, is the point for Hobbes. The Leviathan having enough power will stop it. So back to Madison, if the government could be a Leviathan, Daniel Shays would not dream of kind of marching in a rebellion against the government because he didn't like the fact that the Congress had voted to pass some taxes. This is really a crucial step to get to, because for myself, and what I tell my students, and I'll tell you guys, is when you learn the Locke-Hobbes continuum, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's really not either all Locke or all Hobbes. That's not likely. It's not going to be like that. That's not the way the world works, because I've also driven on I-4 and seen people slow down and let somebody in and help somebody out and pull over. So we know that there are good in humans, and maybe in every human there's good, but there's also the self-focus. So it's kind of a continuum. If you think about, like, if you had a lever and you could move it, you need to ask yourself, well, where would I put the lever on Locke and Hobbes as it relates to power and government? Do I perceive that people are so good that maybe we need a lot more of Locke, and therefore you'd have a lot less police, a lot less rules, a lot less, like we wouldn't have to have driver's licenses, because in Locke's world, everybody's good, and you would only drive a car if you knew how to drive it, and you would be excessively safe. We wouldn't need insurance unless you just wanted to get insurance, because you would know if you crashed into somebody, you would voluntarily pay for their car, and you would not want to crash. You'd drive very, very carefully. Or do you move it more toward Hobbes, where you're like, hey, there's a lot of folks, we need to take their cars away from them right now, because I've been on the roads around Central Florida, and we need to get some cars off the road in Central Florida. That's you thinking. And if you can learn to see Locke and Hobbes, then to me, you can understand everything that our government is in, and the debates and the tensions that we have today, whether it's debates, well, the different debates. I don't want to get us off track. But if you think about the debates today, when you learn Locke and Hobbes, you learn how to put on the glasses of Locke and Hobbes, like, oh, wow, okay, now I see it. And it helps, I think, for myself, and I think for you, understand kind of what is being asked or suggested in our government. All right, so Madison, these guys want to pull this off. How do they do this? Well, they're going to do this by moving the Articles of Confederation Congress to allow for a meeting. So Madison's going to start playing a very sly game. And I'll just tell you now, cards on the table, the Anti-Federalists are right to accuse Madison of, if not treason, then acting in a devious manner, because he was acting in a devious manner. At this point, there's some trade issues amongst the states. In fact, New York and New Jersey are coming close to a war between themselves over who would control the Hudson River and trade on the Hudson River. And so Madison uses this as his moment in Congress, when one of the few times it has a quorum, to say, hey, look, we need to have a meeting that's not in Congress so the states can send representatives in which we can talk about how we fix this trade issue. So Congress says, sure. And so they meet in Annapolis in 1786. And what Madison was really doing, and what he does at the meeting, was pulling a fast one, in which he would have that meeting as his moment to say, hey, you know what? We can't fix the articles. We need to do something different. And so that convention, that meeting in Annapolis, will then ask and get approval to hold a constitutional convention to happen the next year in the early spring in Philadelphia. So Madison's already thinking about what he wants to design. Now, the moment this gets out, the opposition leaps into action. And I must really emphasize to you, we're talking about the rock stars of the revolution: Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, John Hancock, Mercy Owen Warren, whose family, the Otis family, John Adams says, was the principally first family to fight for the revolution. These are the rock stars of the revolution. The Anti-Federalists are not some small group of ne'er-do-well crybabies who are in a corner whining because they didn't get their way. These are people who signed the Declaration. These are people who fought in the war, and they come out immediately because in their minds, they can see where Madison's going. And to be candid, they were right. They saw where he was going and they called him on it. You can see the quote there from Warren, and she writes, "We must inquire into the motives that induced to so bold a step as the annihilation of the independence and sovereignty of the 13 distinct states." Now, I remind you, the term nation is a very modern term. Nobody used the word nation. If she was writing that in the 19th century, she would have said the sovereignty of the 13 distinct nations. Nation is just a word. You can almost say nation equals kingdom, equals state, equals confederation. These are all, to some degree, synonyms politically to describe a specific civic entity. And so for Warren, as I already told you, for many others, there are 13 new nations who work together in a confederation to win a war. And so now these guys are coming out fast and furious, calling Madison on it. Now, Madison's defense against this is in the person of George Washington. George Washington becomes his shield against accusations of treason because he reasoned correctly, nobody's going to call Washington a traitor to his face, and they didn't. And so that kind of forced the Anti-Federalists to pause and wait to see what happened, because they couldn't really go in on Madison as hard as they wanted to once the meeting began, because Washington was there. Washington was only barely there. He did not want to be there. And Madison had to spend several weeks and lots of letter writings to convince the great man to come. Washington was aware and agreed with people like Adams and Madison that there was a problem, but he also was aware, one of his big things for George Washington was his own reputation. So in his mind, my current reputation is as the successful defender of the revolution and the person who successfully got us through the war. And I retired as this winning, I'm an undefeated football coach and I've won, right? I don't know if I want to come back into the story. And Madison's like, yeah, but here's what's about to happen. The whole thing's going to collapse. And so your reputation is going to be tarnished anyway. Madison wins and Washington will come with him. Still, the opposition was strong. Rhode Island says, we're not doing this, we're not coming, and we're not going to be there. Other representatives who showed up, like from North Carolina, pretty much the moment Madison comes out with his plan, they're like, we're out. As you can see, one of the first things they decided to do was to meet in secret, meaning they would not have any publications of what they were doing. Now, Madison's reasoning behind this makes perfect sense. Hey, we're working together, trying to create something. Let's not be casting out wide opinions and whatevers to the world. Let's finish, and then we'll show everybody. But you can also see what the anti-federalists were feeling. As the outsiders, not in the meeting, it felt like, oh yes, you really are doing something treasonous because you won't even tell us what you're doing. So that kind of tension was right there in the mix. Now, Madison understood we're going to have to compromise. And so the first thing he has to do, the first compromise, is to convince people in the room that they would replace the Articles of Confederation. Again, I want to hesitate. When we look at the final signers of the Constitution, almost a third of the people who came to Philadelphia refused to sign it. Some had left earlier, calling the whole thing foul and said, hey, look, this is treason. We're not going down this road. Others didn't say it was treason. They just said, look, you're going towards Hobbes. I don't want to do that. You're replacing the monarch with a monarch. So not going down that road. So Madison had to work first to convince them that the Articles could not be salvaged, in his opinion. He also wanted to try to convince them to make the federal government even stronger than it was. He wanted the federal government to have basically a veto power over any state law. He lost that battle. He could never convince them, the people who supported him, he could never convince them to go down that road because it was, again, a step too far. And so ultimately where we end up, as you know, is a new definition, I might say, of the concept of federalism. And it was this idea that the state and the federal government would have some sort of a balanced and intention, meaning I-N and then T-E-N-S-I-O-N, intention, struggle. Like there would never be, if you ever feel like today, or when you look at the Civil War and you think, oh, why is this state doing this? Or why is there this tension between that state and the federal government? Why is this state being so obstinate? That's the way the founders intended it. They meant it that way. And they were already pressing past what people were comfortable with by giving the federal government this much power. Now, to pull it off, and this is the Constitution's secret sauce and the reason why so much tension occurs about all the decisions. We've had some recent constitutional decisions this year that I know you know of. And the reason those are so intense and tense between us is because of how ambiguous the document was. In the end, its secret sauce was the fact that through its ambiguity, it became elastic. That would allow the Constitution to stretch and kind of pull in different directions. And at least for now, what are we at? We're in year 240 somewhat. They're getting close to 250. It's made it. But that doesn't mean it will necessarily always make it. But the reason it's made it is because of its ambiguity and the compromises that got us there. So now, what are these compromises? Let's walk through it. These are not necessarily in a specific order of importance or when they did them. This is just the way I usually talk their way through it. So after they decided about, do we replace it? And they decided we're going to replace it. The next thing was, what do we do with the legislature? It wasn't clear what the best option was. In England, they had two houses, but really the House of Commons does everything. Pennsylvania had already gone for a unicameral system, single house. The Articles were a unicameral system. John Adams in France was already writing openly and avidly, you need two houses. He had been the person who wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, two houses. So they're back and forth. In the Articles of Confederation, the single Congress, the states voted by state, and they had sort of equal voting. So you just had 13 votes on every issue, up to 13 votes. So then if you can see how New York or Virginia might have felt like that's not quite fair because there's a lot more of us than say in Delaware. So why do they get the same vote as we do? So they're back and forth on this. The larger states clearly saying, hey, there's more people here. And if we're going to be true to representation, then you got to hook them up. The smaller states, if we're going to give up some of our sovereignty and be in this larger union, we don't want to get run roughshod over the rich and bigger states that just happen to have more land than us. So as you probably know well, they end up with what's called the Great Compromise. And in the Great Compromise, or it's really more effectively should be known as the Connecticut Compromise, but it's seen as great because it's the one thing where it seemed like maybe they were going to break up. I don't know if I'd say it that way, but some historians, it's the way they say it. And it is, as you know, the two houses, with the lower house being the one nod to democracy. It's the only house where the people are supposed to vote for the representatives. The people are not supposed to vote for anything else, and that is intentional. And if you say, wait, we vote for things now, then yes, we've screwed it up. So the people are supposed to vote for the House, that's their representatives. And this is why in the Constitution, the House was given responsibility for the budget. The House alone should write the budget, not the president, not the Senate. And why? Because it's the people's house. So the people's money should be budgeted by their representatives. The Senate would be the place where there'd be two from every state. And you can basically think in the minds of the founders, the senators were almost meant to be like ambassadors. So, you know, we sent an ambassador to China, an ambassador to Japan and to Germany and stuff like that. Well, Virginia would send an ambassador to the federal government. Georgia would send two ambassadors to the federal government. New York would send two ambassadors to the federal government. And their sole job was to represent the state as an entity. Now, again, you can already see how we've lost all that, and in my opinion, really screwed it up, but that's a different conversation. But so there's the compromise. Next, how do we choose these people? Well, I kind of gave it away already, but they're going to do, because in the articles, the state legislatures chose the representatives that were sent to the Congress in the Articles of Confederation. So we're going to keep doing that. The states were like, yes, we should. But as we already said, while nobody wanted a democracy, there certainly was small d democratic principles that were very important to pretty much everybody. And they wanted that idea. Adams talked a lot about his government, that the best government needed to take concepts from a monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy and blend it together. And so that's, you can sort of see that the Senate becoming something of a version of an aristocracy, with the states choosing some elite members to go, and the president being like a monarchy. And so then the democracy represented at the House level. So then we're going to vote for them, but we will let the states still choose their representatives. This is one of the reasons why the House representatives are all voted for every 2 years, because it's meant to be to give the citizens of each local area more chances for different people to take the role. They never dreamed in a million years that anybody would be in Congress for decades. It was never their process. They just thought, A, nobody would want to do it. And if they did, they would get voted out after a while. Now, we can say, and a political scientist could give you better information at this point about the incumbency bias and of course, obviously the money and all that kind of stuff. But just we get comfortable with what we know. And unless the incumbent does something terrible, there's almost like an ingrained natural proclivity to vote for them just because you recognize them. And so that's a flaw to the founders' concept, but that was their viewpoint. Meanwhile, the ambassadors who are there for, they're there representing the state, would be there for 6 years. But remember, they're chosen by the state legislatures. So up until, I would say, the disastrous decision to start voting for the senators, the average length of a senator was about 9 years. The reason why was because the state legislatures would have their own turnover. And so there was a sense in which Rhonda's going to be the senator, but after 6 years, Janet wants to be the senator. And we all like Janet too, so we do that. Rhonda come home and Janet goes and represents and is our next senator. There also was, once we get to political parties, once the political parties would shift power in a state, they would immediately pull people home. So Rhonda's political party loses the control at the state level. She didn't get to be the senator. They sent her a message saying, hey, come on home, you're done. We're going to send somebody we want. So the senators had a fairly high turnover, not as much as the representatives, but still much more than we have today, where now we have basically senators for life. All right, the next one then. Now we get to the most controversial and the one that should offend us the most. It certainly does for me. What are we going to do with slaves? Now that we've said that representation will be connected to population, the southern states in particular. Now, but I said, remember earlier, I said all 13 states had slaves. By this point, a few of the northern states had gotten rid of their slaves, And the other northern states were on the process of manumission. It's still going to be a while. There'll be some states that don't do that until the 1790s. But still, from a sense of population in the southern states, it was going to be vital for them to make sure that they could count the slaves, these humans. But then taxation was also going to be connected to the issue of how many humans are there. And of course, the Southerners at that point were like, well, yeah, it's just us white people. So this tension will be made in what becomes the most infuriating and most frustrating decision made by the founders. And I really like to stress to people, don't try to soften this. Don't say they decided that for every 5 slaves, 3. Don't say that they said they just mathematically did 3/5 of the population. No, they were far more insulting than that, far more offensive than that. They said that they would count them as 3/5 of a person. And we have to kind of live with that truth about this moment and not kind of try to water it down in some way. Now, why did they do this? Well, as we've already noted more than once, they don't have a strong unity, right? So it's critical for us to get that. And there was a very clear concern that they couldn't pull this off. Remember, Rhode Island didn't come at all. And by this point, North Carolina has already checked out. Yeah, we're not going to be there. So now you're down to 11 states. And you just fought a war against a superpower with the aid of another superpower in France to make this happen. But you have to remind yourself at this point, the United States is tiny. We're insignificant. We're a small player. We're like one of the little countries at the UN right now that people don't really stick around to listen to their talk of their leader because there's like, 1.5 million people. Nobody cares what they say. No offense to those people from those small, tiny islands or those small, tiny nations. You and I hopefully care for them as people, but we're concerned about what is India saying? What is China saying? And my goodness, what is Putin saying? That's what we're listening to. Well, the United States at this time, we're the tiny country that nobody cares about. So if we break up into these small pieces, can we have a long history of independence without the threat of perhaps being swallowed up? So this is a real concern in their minds. So representatives from South Carolina and Georgia were the loudest about saying, yeah, if you go down this road, we're out too. And so that threat was enough to lead them to try to find a mathematical solution that, again, for me, is really the most offensive thing that was decided upon. This will have huge ramifications later. Almost all the presidents, but 3, 85% of all the federal judges, 75 to 80% of all the cabinet positions will all be Southerners because they will be given an outsized number of representatives in the House of Representatives because of the counting of the African Americans who were at the same time obviously slaves and treated like chattel and property. Next 2, there's 2 more to go. We're almost done. We've got this idea to put a chief executive. Now, this wasn't self-controversial, but they really kind of got past that based on how they wrote the Constitution. There certainly was fears, are we creating a monarchy? But they felt like with what they structured in the Constitution from a rules point of view, that they could get behind it. So there weren't too many people that were deeply opposed. There were some in Philadelphia, but by and large, they're with it. But how are we going to pick this person? What are we going to do? Are we going to have the states choose it? That was the leading idea. Should we have a popular vote? That quickly got shut down. No way. There's no way you want this single leader who could potentially become monarchical to be chosen by popularity. That's like the dumbest thing you could possibly do. Plus, you'd have no idea what kind of person you would get, if they would be a decent or smart or reasoned leader. So where their conclusion was to do what you and I know, which is basically choose a college that would meet every 4 years and they would vote for it. Their idea was basically, could we let each state pick its best and brightest and have those people then vote for who they wished? The Electoral College is an amazing compromise, amazing concept. I always think of Obi-Wan Kenobi talking to Luke Skywalker in the first Star Wars movie when he's showing him a lightsaber and he goes, well, it's a more elegant weapon for a far more civilized age. And that is the way I think about the Electoral College. Most people who hate it don't understand it. It does have its flaws. You and I could say, well, wait, how would we know that the state wouldn't get into cronyism with who got chosen to be in the Electoral College? I think that's a fair criticism. And there we can say, really, you guys are leaning too much into Locke, that people would just be good. And so that may not really let the best representatives represent, are we going to get all aspects of society or just this rich elite? Are you going to let people who are, say, in the trades, or in the future, are you going to let a woman do it? I mean, how can we know that you'll go down that road? So I think there's a reason to critique the Electoral College, but the idea of what they were trying to protect from, not letting the states have any more power, and certainly not letting the people decide. Letting the people decide is the worst possible decision that they could have made. Tells you a lot about where we are today. So last thing, this one's small. It's not small, but we're not going to spend a lot of time here. Right? Who controls the external trade? Remember, I told you there was some sort of a battle between New York and New Jersey, but they settled that. Internally, Congress is going to decide everything. What about externally? And this gets to the slave trade. So once again, the southern states and the slaveholders band together, and they're like, hey, wait a minute, you can't be talking about our slave trade. So they made a decision that was known as the sectional compromise. Sometimes you'll see it as the slave trade compromise, but it's really the sectional compromise in which the Southerners were allowed to have open, free trade of any type, meaning slavery, up until 1808. So they would give 20 years of free trade. And then after that, the federal government was in control. And to their credit, in 1809, the Congress passed a law banning all slave trade, external slave trade. Okay, those compromises then set us in work to say, okay, we're concluded. Let's ratify this thing. But as typical of compromises, everybody wasn't happy, right? You kind of always get that with compromises. So in one of Ben Franklin's final acts on our stage, he really, to some degree, saves the day and summarizes. We could have a whole lesson, a whole hour together here on this speech, and I won't do that to you. But basically, Franklin could tell there was too much muttering in the room. This is on September 17th, when they got to make a final vote. There were too many people unhappy because of the compromises. And so Franklin's decision was, I need to make this speech. Now, he was so old at this point, so ill, he didn't make the speech. He wrote it out, and a younger man made the speech for him. And what he really basically begins to say is, hey, look, you guys know I'm older than all of you. I've seen more than all of you. And some of you think I'm very wise. However, I'm wise enough to, as he says there, doubt my own judgment and pay more respect to the judgment of others. And it's really not as bad a document as you think it is. And he says, it astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. Then he warns them. He says, now look, if you go down this road and you go out of here and you start bad-mouthing the document because you're unhappy about a decision, you're going to ruin everything, because people will be swayed by your opinion. So we need to be unanimous. And he says, I hope, therefore, we shall act heartily and unanimously in recommending this Constitution. And then in this speech, there's one part that I always emphasize because I find it so present for our own times. He's got a warning. He said, look, this document's good and this government's going to work. It'll last for a long time. But, he hints, it can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, even Washington, across the board, the founders, men and women, said one consistent thing to us in our own day. You can only have a government of the people if you have a virtue and values. If you don't have a virtue and values which stand on an education system, you're not going to be able to do it. So that's his warning. It worked. It passes. And again, Constitution Day. But the fact that it passes does not mean that it's our new government, because they had to get it ratified. And here's where Madison basically cheats, right? So what they decided was they would only ask for 9 states to sign off. Now you say, well, Carl, what do you mean he cheats? Well, in the current government that they were under, the Articles of Confederation, you had to have unanimous vote of all 13 states for any amendment to the government. Now, you and I, having worked in enough settings, we know asking for unanimity is a stretch. And it was an unwise move in the writing of the Articles. So I agree with Madison that you weren't going to get anything passed if you needed that. But however, from the anti-federalist point of view, he's going to cheat because you already know 2 states are down. And of course, immediately North Carolina and Rhode Island vote no, we're not doing this. In Rhode Island, there's no doubt how they voted. I mean, 237 to 2,945. I mean, it is over. However, in Madison's defense, there were others who were on board. So Delaware, they're a small state. New Jersey, they were a small state. Georgia, they vote quickly also, and they vote fully in support. Later, Pennsylvania, one of the large states, and Connecticut, they'll vote over 2-1 in favor. So now you got 5 to 2. It's going to be a close run thing. And this is when the very famous battle that kind of centers around the Federalist Papers show up. Because clearly you had to have New York and Virginia. You couldn't do it, Massachusetts to some degree, but you had to have New York and Virginia to make this happen. If you don't have that, you're not going to get there. So Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay begin writing a series of newspaper articles that are like, we call them editorials, but they're far longer than any editorial you would see in the paper today, to say, hey, look, we're going to have to go and try to argue this point, particularly for New York and Virginia. So they do in the Federalist Papers. Now, the anti-federalists, they are going to argue against them. But what Hamilton has to really kind of prove is that this can work over a large scale of land. Because you and I know, due to the war, we've got all the way to the Mississippi River, and we've got our hearts and minds on the whole continent. So how are we going to pull that off? Well, Madison argues in claiming that what we can do is use our differences to our defense. And what he's really doing is claiming what I like to point to is a more modern architectural concept called tensegrity, tension and integrity. Buckminster Fuller was the first to really do this and kind of you could create a structure that would have stability even while it looked like it couldn't really hold. To me, more natural example is think of a spider web. How does a spider web have structural integrity? The spider puts tension on the outer edges of its design to create the form that you and I see, in which it then lives and collects bugs. And if you've ever been mean, like I have from time to time, and you see one and you kind of just take off the bottom part of its legs, what does it do? It just kind of droops and hangs there limply, right? It's lost its structure. So Madison argues that the large size and where we will have differences between, say, rich and poor, industry and agriculture, poor and rich, city and farm, these things will all work to our advantage. And the only time it could really be bad would be if differences ever congealed into one geographic section. In other words, you and I can see how we will end up in the Civil War that we do fight in 1860. What did his opponents say? His opponents go the other direction. They say, what you're arguing is you're arguing for more power in the government to create the exact same government that we just fought a revolution against. Liberty becomes their watchword, that our rights or our liberties are being taken from us from a document like that. They're saying we don't need a Hobbesian government. Your concerns of the things that you think are weaknesses, like the money, and it's only been the government for 6 years. Give it some time. Let us work it out over 20, 30, 40 years, and we'll get our footing. We'll get there. You guys in Europe are concerned about the debt. We'll figure it out. So they're trying to stress that. And when you read Warren, and I won't read all this to you, this is all from Mercy Otis Warren, who's one of the brilliant revolutionary leaders, like I told you about already. I mean, she is on it, right? You're building an aristocratic tyranny. You're going to give us an uncontrolled despotism. There's no security in the system. There's no liberty of the press. There's no limits to the judiciary. When you read the Constitution, as you may know and be aware of, there's very little written about what the Supreme Court was supposed to look like. How much power was it supposed to have? Nothing's in there about how many members should be in the Supreme Court. There's nothing in there about what we call judicial review. That's a creation by Chief Justice Marshall in 1803 as an outcome of Madison v. Marbury. So what she's noting this, right? There's nothing in the Constitution about trial by jury. So there's no protection of this. And so she says, look, when the meeting began, no state would have sent representatives. to see a consolidated system destroy our state governments. So this is a very powerful argument, and it begins to have an impact on the voting. The Anti-Federalists had more support in the rural areas, same place where Shays' Rebellion happened. Unfortunately for them, for the Anti-Federalists, the Federalists will dominate the papers. Obviously, Hamilton writes the majority of them, and as you may know, Hamilton was a great wordsmith, and he and Madison are writing really compelling arguments. And then, as you also know, to be labeled anti-anything is to lose the argument. So the Anti-Federalists didn't call themselves Anti-Federalists. That was the label given to them by the supporters of the Constitution. And they never rebounded. They didn't come up with some other cool name, which is why, by the way, when you get to your first political parties, they're going to name themselves and try to come up with cool names like the Federalist Party or the Republican Party. Madison, though, knows how tight this is being run in Virginia. Early on, he's trying to run to be a representative at the convention to vote. So basically, vote for me and I'll vote for the Constitution. And it seems like he's going to lose. So about halfway through this kind of period, Madison starts giving in and telling people, yes, there needs to be some amendments that specify these rights. We will do this once we're elected. And he does win his election to be the representative in Virginia for the Constitutional Convention for the Virginians. And that will lead to Virginia successfully voting. You can see in spring, Massachusetts votes, then South Carolina and Maryland, they're overwhelmingly behind. And New Hampshire votes on June 21st, becoming the 9th state needed. So it had passed. But again, so you got 9 in, you've got Rhode Island, North Carolina out, but you don't have Virginia and New York. But then in June and July, largely due to the Federalist Papers, New York and Virginia will vote. But I want you to look at all these votes, 187, whoops, my bad, 187 to 68, 57 to 46, 89 to 79, 30 to 27. These are all very close run things. And there's that map again I showed you at the beginning that shows you where the opposition support, kind of in the orange color, is. It's widespread, right? So this becomes the real challenge. And if you were going further in your kind of study of American history, it'll be the challenge that Washington, Adams, Jefferson, the first government will have to confront, because you've got unhappy people who have voted for this. They're not solidly, it's not like, yay, the Constitution. It's kind of like, yeah, okay, maybe. And they've got to deal with the fact that they don't have 2 states with them. What are we going to do? Well, this is bringing us to the end. Of course, they will vote. They'll have the Articles of Confederation agrees. They'll choose the electors. They'll elect the president, as I already told you. There's a decision whether to do this. When I put this, Rhode Island, North Carolina, Delaware, Maryland, all vote no. That's one of the last votes in the Articles of Confederation Congress. And so poor Rhode Island and North Carolina are desperately trying to stop this. And they tried to get enough no votes about the dates to select. Again, the Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress, is setting these dates in motion. And in that moment, they're trying to vote. They don't win. So now Rhode Island, North Carolina, they're just not in the United States. When George Washington is a president, he's a president of an 11-state country, not a 13-state country. And North Carolina and Rhode Island will have to be kind of reeled in. North Carolina, it's a little easier. Rhode Island, they take a very long time before they get in there. They will pass the next amendments that we call the Bill of Rights. They never call them the Bill of Rights, but they'll pass those. This idea of loose and strict construction, I won't go down that road because it takes too long. I want to stop and make sure there's time for some questions. And the tension will, as I said, be there for the founders to kind of deal with. And it kind of leaves us with this question that I think is useful as you consider the history of the country. Who exactly are the founders? Is it the founding fathers that people talk about? Or is it the founding brothers? Joe Ellis's term for the guys who basically run the government, Washington and those guys. We won't answer that in this moment, but they're not the same group. And it is that tension that I think you've kind of got to keep in mind. Or if you want to ask it another way, who's in charge of the country, Hobbes or Locke? And that tension will be at the center of everything our country wrestles with to this very day. And that, ladies and gentlemen, or ladies, or whoever's on the call, It will be where I'll stop so you can ask questions. I don't know if Janet, you want to moderate that or you just want to just let people talk, but I love talking about this stuff. And so I'm more than happy to answer your questions. And I'm actually going to give you this next slide where my email address is. So I'm very happy if you want to email me about something to have that conversation by email, but I'd love to, as long as Janet wants to host, as long as you guys are willing to address any questions that somebody may have.
So Carl, it might be a good idea to stop sharing so you can see everybody's faces, and then we can allow people to ask questions.
You got it.
So does anybody have any questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Cindy, my name is Cindy, and don't have my video on because I'm doing many things at once.
That's quite all right, Cindy. Thank you for
But I
asking.
loved your presentation. Thank you so much for explaining it the way you did. My question is, I have always wondered why the Quakers and the abolitionists could not have stopped the powers that be that were trying to get the Constitution together. Why didn't the Quakers and the abolitionists have more power to stop so that slavery would not have been allowed?
That's a great question. The short answer is there just weren't enough of them. That's the short answer. Even when you get to the 1830s and you get the second abolition movement beginning with the great leaders who will lead into ultimately in many cases you could say, forcing the Civil War to happen. They were always in the minority, and so vast minority. And so remember, all 13 states had slaves. All 13 states had economics tied into slavery. And so there just weren't enough people who saw it as a net negative. They were there. There were some abolitionists in the Constitutional Convention. The argument about 3/5 was not just about economics. There were several people who were offended by the concept and did raise the very obvious question that many of us ask, as I put on one of the slides: how can you be kind of a government around liberty and yet have an enslaved population of any kind? And so they were raising those questions. And I know it's frustrating. Well, I think for many of us, it's very frustrating. So we would wish them to do what you said, at least be louder, if nothing else. And so then there's a sense of either shame or frustration as we look back. The one thing I would say is that though we were not what we wished, the very first abolitionist societies were born here in the United States in consultation with what was happening in England, the Clapham Society, and where those guys are going to go in England. But some of the very first organized societies opposing it were here. Ben Franklin's very last act, once Washington is elected, is to write a letter to Congress for the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, demanding that Congress take a step. Of course, they wouldn't. But so, it's to his credit and the credit of many that they did fight that fight. It didn't get where I would wish, but nonetheless, that's probably the easiest answer, Cindy.
Great, that's the best one. I never thought about not having enough numbers, but thank you.
Yeah, so this will shock some of you, and I don't want to lead you off on another question. You have to remember that Abraham Lincoln is not an abolitionist. So he's the president candidate for an abolition party. The Republicans were the third iteration of a political party movement to try to take over the government in order to put abolition into law, right? They could never get elected. So even in 1860, they had to choose a moderate who was not an abolitionist in order to have broad enough support to win the election. So even then, the vast majority of Americans, I would say, if you'd put it to a public opinion poll, even a secret poll, it would have been maybe 30-70, 30% in support of abolition. So abolition was not a popular thing amongst most people, and certainly not in 1787. Good question.
Hi, this is Pat. I don't have my.
That's okay. You don't have to have your face on. That's good. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I just want to tell you, you really brought the Constitution to life for me.
Thank you. Thank you.
I thought it was very dry and, just another document that, we had to memorize and learn in school and whatnot, but you really made it interesting. You brought it to life and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Beth, did you want to ask a question? I think I saw your hand.
I do.
we talk a lot about the Judeo-Christian tradition in our country.
Mhm.
And I mentioned reading Travel with George, where he actually made a statement about religious freedom in Rhode Island early on. Can you talk about the spiritual influence? You know, I didn't understand the Locke Hobbes things before you presented. That was so wonderful. And I'm wondering about the spiritual influences.
Yeah, so this is obviously one of the most challenging things in our country. There's a lot to say here. I'm trying to think of the best way to say it. Is in the
You can come
ether.
back.
No. It was in the atmosphere.
Okay.
Meaning, even for someone like Jefferson, of course, Jefferson wasn't there, but people like Jefferson, you know, he writes the Declaration saying, we have our rights because life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which is not a governing document, by the way, but people think of it in that terms, but it's useful to say for this, right? Endowed by our Creator. He was very intentional about saying that. So it was sort of like in the ether that this concept of a government of laws would be dependent upon some sense in which laws came from above us or beyond us. And so that was not something that they, you know, had to say openly, because they just, it was almost assumed in the way that they did. Now, again, we hasten to say that they were not trying to set up a Christian nation. And they were not, if you had gone and reviewed the lives of the 39 men who signed the Constitution, if you happen to be a Christian or you happen to be a student of religion, you might conclude that a lot of them were not living like Christians or what you think the Bible says, which is fair. So again, it's sort of it just was an assumed aspect of like their undertaking. When I teach the founding of the country to the students, for myself, there are 4 founding themes that weave in almost like DNA to who are the Americans, who are these people? And the 2 dominant ones to me, you see right off the bat in our earliest foundings, and that the founding was based around capitalism, Jamestown, come and make money. Jamestown will be no different than if Walmart or Amazon sends the first colony to Mars. They're going to say they're doing it for the United States, but they're not. They're doing it for their stockholders. They're doing it to make money. And we all would know that. We wouldn't be surprised. In fact, when we get on the rocket ship to go, we want a Starbucks to already be there. Right. So that we're thinking, so Jamestown was about a stock operation to make money, capitalism and Christianity. Those 2 C's, capitalism and Christianity, are the 2 dominant themes that run through. People think, oh, the United States was founded for religious liberty. No, it wasn't. The United States was founded for Christian freedom of expression. But immediately upon the founding, they realized, oh, wait, these other Christians who I don't like are there. And so that's where we eventually will go down the road to saying, well, we're going to have to work together somehow. And oh, wait, look, there's some Jewish people here now, and we should honor them. And that's where we begin our movement to creating religious freedom, which will enshrine in our First Amendment, where we will talk about religion as the term. And of course, you know, over the 250 years, then we'll broaden that to mean a whole bunch of things, including the choice to not have a religion, to not believe anything about any kind of spiritual concept. So that it all begins back there. And as far as the writing the Constitution or their thought process, the Christian ethos was just sort of in the atmosphere.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, we are about over our time, but before we go, Dolores, would you like to share about our continuation with the film and the book club for everybody?
Yes, thank you. This has been so excellent. I really thank you. We all really thank you for this presentation. But we want to continue looking at the founding of our country through our book club and film club this coming week. On Wednesday, we're going to be discussing Travels with George and his decision to visit every one of the 13 former colonies to try and get support for the Constitution. And then on Thursday at 10:30, we'll be talking about the film, George Washington, The Forging of a Nation, because that deals specifically with the 8 years while he served as president. And again, the struggles that the country was going through to become a country and not just a bunch of former colonies. So please join us for those. And thank you again, Carl. This was wonderful.
Yep, Carl, I just have to echo. I mean, I tell you, I mean, we've all studied it, like Pat said, but boy, just to hear your passion around this topic just got me all excited again. So I tell you, it was great. So thank you everyone for spending your evening with us. Thank you, Carl, for your time, and Rhonda, thank you for all you did. And we look forward to, hopefully many more. So thank you so much, and hope everybody has a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.